I've waited for this moment a long time. I came here to talk about my dance company, but this is not why I'm here. I didn't think I could say it out loud. It feels so strange, but this is the first time since I was a little girl that I feel safe. Oh, I know how cynical it must all sound, but I wish to stop impersonating the free spirit of Nadia Arkadina. I was named Nadia Arkadina by my grandmother when she sent my mother away. Get lost in the white landscape. No one must know who fathered you. My mother stood, her eyes frozen with tears. She was biting her lips. I ran to her. Grandmother whispered, "Don't hug, don't cry. There are eyes watching you." Grandmother held me back. My mother walked out the door for a short walk. I never saw her again. I never knew my father. And then grandmother sent me away. That winter, I mastered the art of survival. Grandmother took me far away. We traveled for weeks. We lived in hiding till one day a Jewish girl died. Her death was not reported. I assumed her name and took her place. I entered the room. The grandparents were there, all seated at the festive table with candles and unleavened bread. The father sang. Davik, the eldest son, pulled me out of my chair and led me in a slow dance. Believing he was dancing with his dead sister's soul, he said we were doomed. In heaven, he said, boys and girls hop across white clouds, munching challah, singing Sabbath songs. I went on dancing the reincarnation, waiting for war. War. I was peeking through the window when the father rushed to hide me in the big chest on top of the clean Saturday linen. The smell of clean linen, I can still smell it. The father was standing against the chest when they walked in shouting, "Dirty pig." I heard a gunshot. They shot the father in the face. I opened the lid for air. "Dirty pig," and his blood started to drip all over the clean Saturday's linen. I heard another shot and another. They shot everyone in the room. I heard the mother scream, and the great aunt, who was too old for them, was shot in her face, right between her eyes. Then, when I heard no more shots, I tried to push the lid open. The father was leaning against it. His blood dripped all over me. He fell to the floor. The mother was there. She didn't say a word. She was lying in blood. Her older sister was writhing in pain. Poor little woman, never touched by a man. Even we, the children, knew that. She crawled to the kitchen and slit her wrists with a knife, crying, "Why didn't they shoot me?" Davik's grandfather walked in, his beard torn off. He had been tied to a car by his beard and dragged through the streets for their amusement. He took out his best Saturday trousers, boy's cap, and said, "Hear my soul. You must hide your maidenhood, cut off your braids, put on this fringe garment, trousers, boy's cap, and run." I ran from a hiding place in the underbrush. I saw them crucify the old man on the gate of the house and trace a Star of David on his chest with bullets. Davik went down on his knees, begging them to spare his grandfather's life. A soldier severed his head with one stroke of his bayonet. I ran. I came to a church at high mass. I told them, run, the soldiers are coming. They looked at me and laughed. I hid in the belfry. A volley of gunshots rang out through the church. The soldiers threw burning pages, straw, twigs down the aisle. A young girl ran up to me, her dress set aflame. I tore off her burning clothes, her soft golden hair loose, a cross dangling at her neck. She hugged me and thanked me. I took off some of my clothes to cover her. Perceiving my disguise, she threw down my fringed garment and fled, crying, "Dirty Jew." Down in the courtyard, the soldiers had her violated by their specially trained dog. We passed through the gate stark naked. Outside on a green lawn, a band of girls dressed in blue and white played tunes from the Merry Widow. They told us we were going to shower. They even gave us towels. Heat rose from the furnaces. It was hot inside. Suddenly, I felt a cool hand on my shoulder, clutching. The other scout crowded in. I stood alone in the stinking courtyard. I wanted to run for the other gate, but the cool hand held me back, caressing. He wore black boots and an insipid smile. His eager hand slid downward, teasing. I wanted to run for the other gate, but I couldn't. My benefactor took me home with him. He unlaced his black boots and ordered his aching back cured. Love me, he commanded. Only those who bring joy to the masters may live. Did you see them, the stinking herd? But you, fresh and naked, I saved you, and you deny me love? Go. He told me to go. If anyone will take you, go. He knew no one would take me. All the ports were closed, all the borders were sealed. Even the gates of the Holy Land were locked by the noble Englishmen. What should we do with them? Where should we be if they dump 1,000,000 Jews on us? Those were their words. They locked us out of their world, and when the clouds of smoke hung in the skies high above the camps, they made believe it was bad weather. My benefactor laughed. He pulled out a page of a daily newspaper. This was my first English lesson. It was a full-page ad set in heavy type for sale. 70,000 Jews at $50 apiece, guaranteed human beings. I didn't believe him. I thought he made it up. He laughed. I didn't know who they were, but he told me that Kurt Weill and Ben Hecht paid for these ads, and he was only doing his job. He had to get rid of 70,000 Jewish kids. All the Allies had to do was pay for these kids' transportation. They didn't, he said. So he had them shipped in cattle cars to be turned into ashes, as sold as fertilizer. Your ground bones could provide excellent fertilizer for cabbages, he sneered. I danced to the strains of gypsy music. I danced. He beat me with an ox-hide whip and made me count the strokes aloud. I danced, evading his whip. I danced to the rhythm of his stroke. He wept, he clawed, he bit angrily, panting, "Who are you? Who?" Two high-ranking officers saw my dancing shadow through the window. They stood mesmerized. When I stopped, they clicked their heels. "Introduce us to your naked shadow," they said. "Just a little gypsy," my benefactor answered laughingly. "Who are you?" the officers asked. "My name is Nadia Arkadina." I was no longer the dancing spirit of the Jewish girl. "You must share your little treasure," the officers told my benefactor. They drove me along the retreating lines. I was made to dance to boost the morale of the defeated army, accompanied by Europe's finest first violinist. I was placed behind a lit curtain to repeat my shadow dance, slowly revealing me in the flesh to scar-faced officers and their quislings. When night after night the Allied bombers raided the lines, my dancing stopped. I was driven to a camp. I was thrown into a barracks full of starving inmates. Helpless and numb, I lay watching the young girls die. Silently, I kept talking to God, kept repeating Nadia Arkadina's family history. When the Allies liberated the camp, I was the only survivor in my barracks. They flung open the doors. I felt the chill of the fresh air. My eyes adjusted to the sunlight, but I couldn't move. Men walked in. One of them bent over me and said, "When I get back home, I'll make sure this never happens again." What did he say? Someone translated. Who is he? I asked. My name is Henry Jackson, the tall man said. When I get back to the States, I'll make sure this never happens again. On a reflective tray in a hospital, I caught a glimpse of my face, my shaved head, my sunken eyes. I had nothing left, not even a photograph of my pink cheeks and long braids. When I was a little girl, I used to close my eyes at night and wish I'd wake up a young woman. Lying there in the hospital bed, I closed my eyes and wished I'd wake up as a little girl and see grandmother mashing potatoes on my plate with a fork and then topping it with a heaping wooden spoon of sour cream. Years later, I choreographed a dance I called Playtime. Each dancer brought to it his own childhood memories and fantasies. The dance was all innocence and joy. After the first dress rehearsal, it was censured as trivial. It was never performed. The spontaneity, freedom, and joy that the dancers exhibited were too provocative for censors who forgot what spontaneity and joy were all about. But my dancers and I would never forget. I began conceiving that dance with finger puppets I made in my hospital bed. But that game didn't last. What are you, male, female, Jew, gypsy? They were identifying our surviving skeletons. I was put on a stretcher and carried to another barracks. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my benefactor. He was disguised as an inmate in striped uniform. I mustered all the strength I could, jumped off the stretcher and started to run. I chased him in an open field. I caught hold of him and cried, You brought me here. He managed to free himself of my grip, pushed me to the ground, and disappeared in a crowd of liberated inmates disguised as one of them. Wounded prisoners of war, making their way to the railway, found me. A young army doctor with big bright eyes carried me to the train. I let out a cry. I woke up in a sweat. Lying on a cot in a moving train, the army doctor was taking my pulse. Who are you? He asked. My name is Nadia Arkadina. He knew my name. He knew Nadia Arkadina's family history. He told me. I talked in my sleep. What else did I say? I must have sounded frightened. The young doctor touched my face. He said, well, you talked to your God. You danced to strains of gypsy music. You hopped across white clouds, munching challah, lighting 2 candles as the sun sets on the 6th day. Where did you learn all this? He asked. My body stiffened. I tried to control my trembling. Was he testing me? What else did I say in my sleep? The doctor, the loving doctor, held me. He told me I had to eat. I was weak from malnutrition. Suddenly, the train stopped. We heard voices. Wounded soldiers who were lying on the floor sat up. The doors opened. We were ordered out. Pretend you are a boy, the doctor said, touching my shaved head. I put on the soldier's uniform, pretended I was a boy, like all the rest. Angry comrades were forcing us to change trains. The doctor asked for help with the wounded soldiers. He identified himself. He was a hero on his way to collect his medals. The comrades were unimpressed. Why did you surrender to the enemy? They asked. He told them he saved these men in battle under enemy fire and when they were taken prisoner. Can you prove it? They asked. They refused to question the wounded soldiers. As far as they were concerned, we were all traitors who surrendered to the enemy. The young doctor was not intimidated. He sought out the highest-ranking comrade and told him that these men had not surrendered. They had been left behind and captured by the enemy. The comrade smiled. Are you a Jew? Yes, I am a Jew, the doctor said. I saw him clench his fist, his face flushed with anger. They didn't ask him this question when they sent him to battle. There were thousands of decorated Jewish war heroes. They fought with tenacity and valor. Tens of thousands of them lost their lives and left their limbs on battlefields to save our land. Our army was ill-equipped and ill-prepared for battle. In the purges before the war, the party ordered the execution of some of our best officers. They put their trust in Hitler. They signed a non-aggression pact with the Nazis, and we were overrun. We lost millions of our bravest men. Stalin's own son, Yakov, did not surrender. He was captured. He was a brave soldier murdered in captivity by fascists wearing shiny buttoned uniforms like those comrades. They too asked him if he was a Jew, and they kept him alive because they needed him, like those comrades. The Russian officer shouted fire. Suddenly, scores of soldiers lay dead. We rushed into the freight car. The doors were slammed shut. Years later, in a secret speech to a closed party meeting in February 1956, Nikita Khrushchev confirmed the young doctor's allegations that millions were killed by Russians. They accused Stalin. He did it all. Yet Stalin never pulled the trigger. Stalin never fired a single bullet, and millions were killed. Who performed this miracle? They say it's bad taste to ask such a question of a nation with such tragic history. Tragedy perpetrated by whom? At that moment, when the doors were so brutally slammed shut, our eyes met in conspiracy. We knew we were being dispersed to a forced labor camp to be buried in the white wilderness. What do? I asked the doctor. Dance and survive. The loving doctor gave me a notebook, told me to keep a diary and write it in code. He took out a little harmonica and played a haunting melody. I danced in place, moving ever so slowly, casting my shadow over the wounded soldiers. They hummed the melody, their eyes shining with tears. We were one big family, but I stayed awake, never to betray my thoughts. On our way, the train came to a sudden halt near a little Polish town. A wounded woman carrying a bleeding child in her arms was running along the railway tracks. She told the doctor that she had given birth to the child when they were liberated from a concentration camp. She and 300 other Jewish survivors returned to their Polish hometown. The Poles occupying their homes massacred every single one of them. Only she and the child ran away. The Russian officer ordered the train to move on, leaving the woman and child in a pool of blood. There was nothing the young doctor could do. Imprisoned behind the closed door, he stood crying, Yitgadal v'yitgadash mei Rabbah. When all were asleep, I began to write a fictional diary of a bird without wings. By the second week of our ride into exile, I asked the doctor to read it. I had to test my code. Every once in a while, he would look up at me. It was as though he was seeing through me. When he finished, he told me to memorize it. A notebook could be destroyed. Memories could not be erased. What I had seen, where I had been, was an indictment many would want, forgotten and buried. It must be remembered and told. Ever since then, I've been writing my fictional diary and committing it to memory. There was nothing the young doctor could do. Imprisoned behind the closed door, he stood crying, Yitgadal v'yitgadash mei Rabbah. As the train was leaving the Polish border, the young doctor looked out and asked, whom will the Poles persecute once they rid the land of all the Jews? Oh, we were back on Russian soil. Our black earth, our wide open fields, our forests, our motherland. I was born on this land, the doctor said. My father and grandfather knew only one landscape, this land. Yet when Ivanovich steals, he's a thief. When Abramovich steals, he's a Jew. But when Abramovich dies heroically for his motherland, he's an unknown soldier. This is the law of cowards. Brave men do not seek a scapegoat. You saw them in Europe with their pure snowing mountains and beautiful daffodil valleys. They practiced bigotry and hatred in their archaic cathedrals and glorious squares. They saw it in the making all through the ages before the beer parlors were there. In medieval Italy, after an earthquake, Jews were buried alive. During the plague, they were burned. In Spain, after the destruction of the Mauritanian state, the Inquisition began. The first pogroms were the work of the Crusaders on their way to the Holy Land. The Tsars were only doing their share. One of the wounded soldiers stood up and spit in the doctor's face. Long live the Tsar, he said. What did the Tsar do for you, the doctor asked. You Jews, the Kremlin is full of you. I'm not up there in the Kremlin. I'm here with you, the doctor said. Who are those comrades out there? Guarding our trains with machine guns, uprooting whole nations to be enslaved in exile. Shut your eyes, and before you know it, there will be heaps of bodies in front of you. The circumcised and the baptized. Only demented, paranoid cowards send their liberated heroes into exile. Why, the wounded soldier cried, why? Because you want the Tsars and the Stalins, and they have their savages out there. And I share your tolerance for suffering, but I'm not a liar like you. I don't look for scapegoats, and I won't be one. The wounded soldier took the doctor's hand and kissed it. When they embraced, he collapsed in the doctor's arms. There were no medications to ease the pain. The doctor took out his harmonica and played. We saw the soldier's face relax, his eyes go blank. We buried him. Well, wherever the train passed, there were suffering faces, eyes staring, searching for a familiar face. They must have been standing out there for days on end, waiting, hoping. They knew where the trains were heading, and they knew this might be their last chance to see, to wave, to part. The train stopped. Oh, suddenly I saw her face. I could never have mistaken her eyes. I leaped out the door, and before the guard could turn, I was in grandmother's arms. She bundled me in a blanket. The guard kept searching, but all he could see was an old woman bundling a girl in a blanket. The doctor waved with a sad smile. Don't wave back, grandmother said. I will come to see you dance, he shouted. He will keep his promise, grandmother said. We walked away. When no one could hear or see, she took me in her arms and said, cry, my child, talk, tell it all. When I finished reciting my diary, she took me in her arms and said, a flag will be painted with blue ink, 2 stripes and an ancient star on a white cloth, and a state will be reborn in the desert by the sea. And those who banish God in their land will have their red flags saturated with blood for generations to come. Grandmother pressed this pendant in my hand and told me we must part as strangers. She led me to a building. I watched her walk away. She didn't turn back. All I had to do was knock on the door and identify myself. The confusion of war allowed me to assume the identity of Nadia Arkadievna without explanations. The childless people who sheltered me had their secrets. I was their link to the past. The woman was a leading radiologist, her husband a professor of law. They were Orthodox Christians, but never went to church. They were party members and followed the party lines, and their religious beliefs were buried inside. The professor whispered to me, You need a career to survive, and you cannot survive with integrity. Integrity will only lead you into exile. We all administer the terror, he told me. There were many students and teachers in the academy whose responsibility it was to report to the authorities, report what was said and what was done. Today, someone is your best friend. Tomorrow he will surface as your chief accuser in some fabricated treason charge. The professor kissed me goodnight and went to sleep. Good night. It wasn't long before I realized who this loving professor was. One morning, my dance coach took me aside and asked me if the people I lived with could help her father who was just arrested. But he's only a professor of law, I said. She started to cry. She didn't mean to hurt my feelings. She thought I knew. Knew what? That he was with the secret police. Grandmother knew what she was doing. She found a safe haven for me right there in the lion's den. To survive. I kept to myself, but I had to be careful not to be too secretive. So I acquired the reputation of an introvert. And in my mind, I conceived whole ballets, 7 rows of dancers dressed in black, a stone in each hand, clashing the stones together rhythmically. A girl clad in a pink-toned leotard appears behind a lit curtain in a slow shadow dance. Babiyar. Men, women, children, babes in arms. Soldier shouts, undress. We fold our clothes, underwear, shoes. There's no weeping, no screaming, no pleading for mercy. Families stand together, kissing each other goodbye. I stand alone, clutching grandfather's trousers. We're ordered down to go into a pit filled with bodies. Suddenly they open fire, mowing us down. I fall flat on my stomach. They bury the bodies and hose us with water. Soft sighs of dying. Eyes staring blankly at the sky, the water tinted with blood purples, then darkens. I'm being pulled down to the bottom of the pit. The water cuts right through me. I try to crawl out of the pit. I crawl out of the pit and start to run. It went on and on and on. But I knew it couldn't work out in my head. It had to break out of my body and leap into space. Well, I was given everything, every leading role a young dancer could wish for. But I felt like a mechanical doll tiptoeing in my pink leotard. I wanted my soul to sail out of my body, to tell who I was, where I'd been. I wanted audiences to be moved, touched to the core of their being. How could I do it disguised in white lace? I had to keep reminding myself of grandmother's warnings. Walking out, after a performance one evening, I had the feeling I was being followed. I walked as fast as I could without acknowledging my fear. Sometimes I was scared by the echo of my own footsteps, but this time I knew I was being followed. I felt a touch on my arm and heard my name. I started to run. I knew I couldn't run wildly in the streets without attracting attention. Suddenly my legs sagged. I caught hold of a bench and sat down. and I began to sob. Why? Why did I run? It was his voice, his gentle touch on my arm. It was the young doctor. He must have come to see me dance. Why didn't he come backstage? Why the secrecy? Why? Why did I run? I scared him away. Suddenly, two arms stretched out to me. Tears blurred my vision. I couldn't see, I couldn't hear. All I could feel was his embrace. Come, he said, let's hop across white clouds and munch challah. Grandmother's last warning to me was trust no one. But I had to love in order to survive. I didn't reveal my identity, but Vasily and I were married. For obvious reasons, I don't refer to people by their names. Vasily's parents were zealot Bolsheviks. For them, the revolution meant liberation from the pogroms of the Tsar and a bright new future. They were not disturbed by their Jewishness. Their Jewishness was just a genetic fact of life. I suspect they didn't care about Nadia Arkadina's identity, and I was welcomed. In my house, Vasily's identity was less welcomed. Why a Jew? The professor asked. You have a brilliant career ahead of you. Why jeopardize it? I was confronted by two loving people who cared and feared for me. The professor's wife, who was drinking all that evening, took me to her room, pleading, why? What was this unabashed desire to come into conjugal contact with Semitic lovers? Was it the mystery they provoked? What was this aura of confidence? I tried, but I couldn't stop her. She knew a student in medical school, and he was a stranger in their midst, and so she explained her attraction to him. He was kind, urgent, curly black hair, pale skin, hooked nose, and all. Oh, how well she knew their kind. Verbally intelligent, susceptible to reason, articulate, shrewd, greedy, conniving, and always projecting an aura of confidence. Why? Why must they always criticize, discover, change? Give them a chance, and the world is full of their Karl Marxes, their Trotskys, their Einsteins, their Freuds. And Christ, said the professor, when he walked into the room. They killed Christ, she cried. Christ was one of them, the professor said. And according to Freud, we seek revenge on their people for having brought upon us the birth of Christ. The woman grabbed me and embraced me. You brought us so much joy, my child. I'm so frightened for you. The following day, the professor took me out for a walk, a long walk where no one could hear what he had to say. He apologized for his wife's outbursts. This was what Mother Russia gave her, a heart pumping with fear. No, she was not paranoid. Her fear was well-founded. Stalin was about to launch his final campaign against the Jews. Beat the Jews, a tried and tested trick used by the Tsar Nicholas. We need scapegoats. Don't be one of them, he shouted. I'm going to have a child, I said. The professor's eyes lit with laughter. The reign of terror was forgotten. The promise of life was welcomed with a bubbling of champagne and caviar. In the land of arbitrary terror, happiness is short-lived. Vasily's parents were sent into exile. I spent my pregnancy choreographing my first ballet. And it wasn't long before Vasily was arrested. In a wave of mass arrests, Vasily was banished. And I was left with a beautiful gift of life, our son Ilya, a cheeky-faced redhead with big bright eyes like his father's. Once he began to smile, he numbed all the pain. The professor and his wife showered little Ilya with love and devotion in staying with them, in allowing them to love the child of a man whose imprisonment they accepted as gospel. Was I lying to little Ilya? I've lied all my life. Why deny my child the right to survive? To live in a land where good morning is a lie. Yes, from childhood on, we are congenital liars. Oh, I know how difficult it is for you to understand this. You wake up in the morning to the promise of a new day. You welcome new friendships. You teach your children to love, trust, to make friends, to think for themselves. Isn't this what freedom is all about? Well, my impulse was always to embrace people, to get to know, to learn. But the instinct for self-preservation prevailed. And suspicion stifled all relationships. I never knew when I would be set up. And to this world I brought little Ilya, watching him grow, loving him, and fearing for him. What do I tell him? The ordinary facts of life. His father, where was he? Sitting in a solitary cell, wondering why he was arrested. Here, little Ilya, I have his medals. Here are his medals to show you. And when he comes back from kindergarten and asks, what is a Žid? And I tell him a Jew is one of God's children. But don't repeat it to your teachers. But the children say my father is a Žid. Can you fathom the horror of embracing your child, knowing the moment he enters nursery school, he's a tool of the state? To look into your child's innocently spying eyes, questioning your every movement. Late one night, little Ilya appeared at my door. When is Papa coming home? Yes. I learned of Vasily's death in an official document I received. A posthumous declaration of Vasily's military rank and honors reinstated. The professor and his wife insisted that we celebrate with little Ilya, celebrate his father's rehabilitation as a war hero. It would help the boy with his fears. He should be proud to live in a society that could cleanse itself by renouncing the purges. I will tell the teacher, Ilya said. But melancholy set in his eyes, and it never let go. And I choreographed a work in Vasily's memory. And I took little Ilya to see a dance dress rehearsal. When the dancers in boots dropped the stones that they had in their hands, leaving a man's body covered with the stones on stage. Ilya turned to me and cried, "Why did you let them kill Papa?" He struck me. Not a very hard blow, but it drew blood. Every day that week, I kept licking my lip. I didn't want the wound to heal. Why, a life filled with whys. I told Ilya the bad and evil were buried beneath the white snow, and to shield him, I began believing it myself, censoring my work, living within the system. But before we knew it, Khrushchev launched his own anti-Semitic campaign, and after him came Brezhnev. Everything I told Ilya about Ivan the Terrible and the Tsars were not buried beneath the white snow. I can show you the official anti-Semitic booklet with caricatures and slogans taken from the Nazis' version of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. An article appeared in Pravda explaining the Holocaust as a collaboration between the Jews and the Nazis. One of Ilya's teachers outdid them all. That man on the cross is a Zionist bastard. Could I shield Ilya from that? One night, after hearing Soviet commentators exonerate the killers of the Israeli athletes in Munich, Ilya stopped all athletic training. I didn't make the connection. Ilya was loving and open with me. Was he? We had no secrets, didn't we? Secretly, Ilya began studying the only language outlawed in the Soviet Union, Hebrew. In my dance world, I taught my philosophy, conquered the spirit within you and set it free in space. In other words, you can experience everything only in your mind. No, he did not accept my philosophy. He became an activist, and I didn't object when he applied for immigration to Israel. He kept his activities out of our relationship. Ilya, a brilliant young biologist, was fired as soon as he applied for immigration to Israel. He was under constant surveillance. When he came to our house in the country, we saw agents lurking behind trees, taking snapshots. His apartment was raided and reduced to a shambles. They found nothing incriminating. All he did was apply for an immigration visa. They staged agents outside his door to follow him whenever he went to look for work to make sure he was not hired. He was ready to accept any job, but arrested as a parasite. He faced the court with contemptuous silence. "You will not humiliate us with your nonviolence," the judge said. The verdict and sentence were predetermined: 3 years in a Siberian labor camp. When Ilya returned home, he said very little about the hardship he endured in Siberia. His body said it all. It was pencil thin, rheumatic pain settled in his muscles. He couldn't stand straight. I watched the agonized pain in his face. His eyes looked up at me, questioning. You must survive," I told him. I told him who I was, where I'd been. I gave him grandmother's pendant, our only link to the past. When Ilya was arrested again, they confiscated the pendant he was carrying. He told them that it was grandmother's. The professor took me for a long walk where no one could hear what he had to say. Inside the pendant, they found an old Hebrew scroll. They had it translated. There were no secret codes. It was a mezuzah, and on the corner of it was written, Bat Sheva, Bat Israel. Bat Sheva, daughter of Israel. She had been hiding her Jewishness for generations. My Jewishness. My grandfather, the brain trust of the revolution, the ideological defender of Stalinism, discovered our Jewishness and sent us scrambling into hiding. What is this hatred? I asked the professor. Do you fear our individuality that much? The professor took my hands. He said, we tried to banish God and you awakened God in us. We tried to banish him and you awaken God in us. We are not the only ones. If they would debate the Holocaust in the United Nations today, they would pass a resolution condemning the Zionists for their uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto. The professor took out a visa and handed it to me. Go. You were invited on a lecture tour. Go. I cannot protect you any more than I can protect Ilya. The masses are offended by those who stand alone. We single out the Ilyas to let other ethnic groups know that activism and Zionism is undesirable, a case not to be emulated. We will charge Ilya with Article 64, contact with foreign agents. Article 64, a charge punishable anywhere from 10 years to death. The professor knew. I didn't believe him. He knew. He had to tell me. He told me. Ilya was put on a train and taken on a 5,000-mile trip through Siberia. By the end of the journey, he was delirious, mumbling and crying out. Henry Jackson said it would never happen again. But Ilya had no contact with foreign agents. Ilya never met Senator Jackson. I told it to him. When the Allies liberated the camps, I was the only survivor in my barracks. They flung open the doors. I felt the chill of the fresh air. Men walked in. One of them bent over me and said, when I get back home, I'll make sure this never happens. Who is he? I asked. My name is Henry Jackson, the tall man said. When I get back to the States, I'll make sure it never happens again. Fortunately, my son Ilya survived. Where I've been, what my body endured is an indictment many would want forgotten and buried. I knew that one day I would have to take the stand and bear witness. Ever since then, I've been writing my diary and committing it to memory. Thank you.